I never thought my quiet retirement days would be interrupted by anything more exciting than a squirrel stealing birdseed from the feeder on the porch. My friend Harold and I had been living together for years now, two old men sharing a modest house on the edge of the pine forests outside Bend, Oregon. We spent our days tending the garden, splitting firewood, drinking coffee on the porch, and talking about everything and nothing in particular. Our only other housemate was an old grey tabby cat named Jasper, who had never been much of a hunter, but enjoyed wandering the yard and coming back with burrs tangled in his fur. That morning started no differently. The sun had just broken through a layer of thin clouds, lighting up the dew on the grass, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with Harold, sipping coffee, when I saw Jasper out the window. He was walking across the yard with his tail high, but he wasn't alone. At first, I thought he had cornered a raccoon. Something about the way the small figure moved beside him caught me off guard. But as they got closer, I realized this wasn't any animal I recognized from around here. It waddled clumsily on four broad paws, small but determined, its legs wobbling with the unsteady strength of youth. Its body was covered in shaggy brown fur, matted in places like it had been out in the elements too long. When the morning light struck its face, I froze. The eyes that met mine were golden, deep and intelligent, glinting with something I couldn't quite name. "Harold," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "You're not going to believe this." Harold pushed his chair back and came to the window. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the sill. "Lord above," he whispered, "that's a bear cub." The little creature padded right up to the porch steps alongside Jasper, stopping when Jasper stopped, as if the two had planned this meeting. He wasn't more than knee-high, covered in fur that was a mix of chestnut brown and rusty red. His paws seemed almost too big for his body, his movements both wild and oddly childlike. He didn't seem afraid. In fact, he looked straight at us, his gaze steady, and then turned to Jasper when the cat gave a short, impatient meow. Harold and I stood frozen, unsure whether to bolt the door or open it wide. But Jasper trotted right up to the door, sat down, and looked over his shoulder at the cub, as though introducing him like an old friend. My hands trembled as I cracked the door open. To my shock, the bear cub didn't run. He sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, then stepped closer, his broad paws silent against the wooden boards. Jasper slipped inside without a care in the world, and the cub, he stopped just outside, peering in, studying us as if he were trying to decide whether we were worth trusting. Harold, braver than me, crouched down a few feet away. "Hey there, little guy," he said gently, his voice low and steady like he used when calming skittish animals in the woods. The cub didn't growl, didn't bolt. Instead, he tilted his head, blinked once, and took another step forward. My instincts told me to fetch food. I hurried to the fridge, grabbed a plate of leftover roast chicken, and set it just beyond the doorway. Then I stepped back. The cub lowered his head, sniffed, and then began eating like he hadn't seen food in days. He tore into it clumsily, yet with restraint, glancing up at us now and then, as though making sure we weren't about to snatch it away. Harold and I stood watching, silent, until he was done. When he finished, he sat back on his haunches, his golden eyes studying us with a calm I hadn't expected. "He's friendly," Harold murmured, wonder in his voice. I couldn't help but smile. "I think Jasper made a friend." Over the next few hours, the cub didn't leave the yard. He wandered a bit, inspecting the flower beds, sniffing the wheelbarrow, even tugging at a loose garden glove Harold had left near the shed. Then he returned to the porch. Jasper padded out again to join him, and I swear they sat side by side like two guardians watching the tree line. That evening, the cub appeared at the door once more. This time, I left it open just enough for him to step inside if he chose. He didn't right away, just sat there with his long arms dangling over his knees, his gaze fixed on us. Harold broke the silence by tossing a piece of chicken onto the rug. The little creature padded in, picked it up delicately, and sat down right where he was. We decided to call him Cedar. It seemed fitting since the reddish streaks in his fur reminded us of the cedar trees that dotted the ridges near the creek. Cedar wasn't ours, not really, but he seemed to have decided we were safe enough to visit. The days grew into a pattern. Mornings on the porch with coffee, Jasper wandering the yard, Cedar showing up as though he had a standing invitation. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes trailing after Jasper, as if the old cat were his guide. He began letting us get closer, brushing past Harold's leg one afternoon when he filled the water bowl, even plucking food gently from my hand without so much as a nip. His strength was obvious, but his restraint even more so. We never tried to keep him inside or trap him. He was wild, and we respected that. But he kept coming back, and each time he stayed a little longer. Some nights I would catch his silhouette near the edge of the woods, golden eyes glowing faintly before he'd vanish again into the trees. As autumn settled over the valley, Cedar surprised us by appearing not just in the yard, but in the house. One frosty morning, I stepped out to fetch the mail, and before I knew it, he trotted right past me into the kitchen, as though he had lived there all along. Harold laughed from his chair, shaking his head. "Guess we're in his territory now," he said. Cedar wandered the rooms, sniffing corners, touching his broad nose to the edges of furniture, and then settling himself in front of the space heater with a sigh that sounded almost human. That was the day I realized we weren't just two old men and a cat anymore. We had a bear cub in our circle, or maybe he had us. His friendliness amazed me. He didn't mind if we sat near him while he ate, and sometimes he'd even rest his heavy head against Harold's knee. He never showed aggression, though we both knew he could have. Instead, he seemed content to fold himself into our odd little household whenever it suited him. We began reading everything we could find about orphaned bear cubs, though there wasn't much more than speculation and advice meant for rangers or sanctuaries. Still, we wanted to be sure we weren't harming him by feeding him or making him too dependent. In the end, we decided the best thing was to let him come and go as he pleased. We made a small shelter at the edge of the yard, lined with straw, in case he wanted his own space. He used it sometimes on colder nights, though more often he was at our door, waiting to be let in. Words spread around Bend that two old men had a strange visitor. Some thought we were making it up. Others wanted to see him for themselves. We didn't allow it. Cedar wasn't a spectacle. He was our friend, and we wouldn't risk him feeling cornered. Still, now and then, a neighbor or delivery man would catch sight of him perched on the porch beside Jasper and shake their head in disbelief. By winter, Cedar had grown taller, stronger, his movements more fluid, his gaze sharper. The clumsy wobble of those first weeks was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing both the forest and our home as his own. He had the grace of something untamed, each step silent and deliberate. Yet there was never a moment he carried himself with arrogance. Instead, there was a kind of gentleness in the way he brushed past us, a subtle recognition that he had become part of our days, as naturally as the changing seasons. Despite the undeniable wildness in him, he never turned distant with us. In fact, it felt as though his bond with us only deepened. He had the freedom to vanish into the snow-draped woods whenever he chose, and often he did, leaving behind nothing but paw prints trailing off into the whiteness. But time and again he returned, sometimes at dusk, sometimes long after nightfall, with snow dusting his fur, shaking it off at the threshold, like a guest who knew he belonged. If anything, he grew closer, lingering in the house on stormy nights when the wind howled like some ancient spirit through the eaves. On those evenings, when the forest was swallowed in white and the windows rattled with the weight of winter, he would settle near us without hesitation. He curled up on the rug, as though it had been made for him alone, his body a quiet curve of warmth, his golden eyes softening to half-closed slits as he drifted into rest. Those evenings were my favorite. There was a stillness to them, the kind that seeped into your bones and reminded you what it meant to be safe. Outside, the snow hammered against the windows, piling high against the porch steps, burying the world in silence. Inside, we were three companions, bound not by words, but by trust. The fire hissed occasionally in the stove. Jasper stretched lazily near the heater, with a purr that rumbled like distant thunder, and Cedar's steady breathing filled the room. Looking back now, it still amazes me how it all began. One ordinary morning, Jasper trotted home with a companion, and without knowing it, he opened the door to a new chapter in our lives. We hadn't been searching for change. In fact, we thought our days had settled into their final rhythm, quiet mornings with coffee, afternoons spent tending the garden or reading on the porch, evenings listening to the hum of crickets in the woods. We had no reason to expect anything new, no room set aside in our hearts for another responsibility. But change found us anyway, padding softly up the porch steps on broad little feet with eyes that saw more than we could guess. Cedar slipped into our lives the way a memory returns. Sudden, sharp, and strangely familiar. At first we weren't sure what to make of him, this wild creature choosing our porch as if he had been invited. But the days stretched on, and with them came a quiet rhythm that included him as naturally as breathing. He would appear when he pleased, vanish when the forest called him back, and always return with that same unspoken assurance that somehow he belonged with us too. Cedar was a daily reminder that not all wildness had to be feared. Sometimes it could be welcomed, respected, and even loved for exactly what it was, untamed and beautiful. His presence reshaped the way we looked at our world. The woods behind our house no longer felt like a boundary, but like an extension of our home, alive and pulsing with unseen stories. For two old men who thought their lives had already taken their final shape, Cedar was proof that there is always room for another surprise, another bond, another story to carry forward. He taught us patience, the kind of patience that asks you to wait for trust instead of demanding it. He taught us gentleness in the way he would edge closer each day until one morning he pressed his weight against our legs as though he had decided we were safe. He taught us that companionship doesn't demand ownership, only understanding. And in those lessons, he brought a kind of renewal we hadn't known we needed. Even now, a year later, he still comes around most days. Sometimes it's just a fleeting visit, a shadow slipping across the yard at dusk. Other times, he lingers, stretched out on the porch beside Jasper, the two of them watching the sun sink into the trees like old friends. And then there are stretches when he disappears into the deeper forest. And I catch myself wondering if this is the time he's gone for good. The silence of those days presses harder. The porch feels emptier, the house quieter, and I find myself glancing toward the tree line with a hope I try not to name. But then, just as I begin to think the wild has claimed him fully, I'll hear Jasper's meow at the door, sharp, insistent, carrying a tone I've learned to recognize. And when I look up, I'll see him again. Those golden eyes will catch the light once more, steady and knowing, like a secret gift returned to us. And there he is again, Cedar, our unexpected joy.